Wisdom, wisdom, that's the test. Which rival wisdom team is best? 52 teams of 8 antique rival wisdoms that have passed the test of time to encourage, educate, and entertain generations for centuries.
Quote Team 12. Transform strategically. Quote definitions, biographical context, and synergy analysis too. Replace hate with motivational education to guidealife.com. Quote 12.1. A wise man will make more opportunities than he finds. Francis Bacon 1561 to 1626. Quote definition. Wisdom is not passive. It does not wait for circumstances to deliver favorable openings. The wise person actively creates conditions, builds relationships, positions resources, and generates opportunities that would never have existed without deliberate, intelligent effort. Quote application. The mission of making America wiser and kinder cannot wait for the culture to become receptive, for institutions to become supportive, or for the moment to become convenient. Bacon's principle is the mandate. Wise people build the opportunities that passive waiting would never produce. Every new channel, every new partnership, every new piece of content is a made opportunity. Sir Francis Bacon was born in 1561 in London, the son of Sir Nicholas Bacon, Lord Keeper of the Great Seal under Elizabeth I. He was a child prodigy who entered Trinity College, Cambridge at 12 and emerged convinced, after 3 years of study, that Aristotelian logic, which had dominated European intellectual life for nearly 2,000 years, was fundamentally inadequate as a tool for understanding nature. He spent the rest of his life developing an alternative, an empirical, inductive method of inquiry based on systematic observation, controlled experiment, and the rigorous testing of hypotheses against evidence. His Novum Organum of 1620, which laid out this new scientific method, is one of the most consequential intellectual documents in Western history, the philosophical foundation on which modern science was eventually built. Bacon's professional life was as strategically active as his intellectual life. He spent decades navigating the treacherous currents of Elizabethan and Jacobean court politics, building alliances, cultivating patrons, angling for appointments, and eventually rising to Lord Chancellor of England, the highest legal office in the land. He understood from long experience that the world does not distribute opportunities fairly or generously, and that intelligence applied to creating favorable conditions yields far more than intelligence applied merely to recognizing them. His observation about opportunity making versus opportunity finding was drawn from decades of practiced, strategic, sometimes morally compromised engagement with power. He was later convicted of accepting bribes as Lord Chancellor, but the principle itself is sound and stands independent of his personal failings. This quote specifically encourages individuals to 1. Shift from a passive, receptive posture toward opportunity to an active, generative one, building conditions rather than waiting for them. 2. Apply wisdom strategically. Intelligence is most powerful when it shapes environments rather than merely responding to them. 3. Recognize that most significant opportunities in life are made rather than found. They are the products of preparation, relationship, and deliberate positioning. 4. Invest in creating favorable conditions for others as well. The wise person who makes opportunities for themselves often makes them for those around them simultaneously. Bacon's intellectual legacy is itself a monument to made opportunity. He could not conduct the scientific experiments his method required. He lacked the resources, the instruments, and the institutional support. But by articulating the method with such clarity and force that it became the operating framework of the Royal Society and eventually of modern science itself, he made an opportunity for human knowledge that has compounded for 4 centuries. He found no such opportunity. He created it.
Quote 12.2. A day wasted on others is not wasted on oneself. Charles Dickens, 1812 to 1870. Quote definition. Time and effort invested in serving, helping, and enriching the lives of others is not a sacrifice of personal resources. It is an investment in one's own development, character, meaning, and ultimately happiness. Service to others and self-development are not competing priorities. Quote application. This principle is the antidote to the zero-sum thinking that treats kindness and service as costs. For replacehate.org, Dickens's observation is the case that spreading wisdom and practicing kindness is not a drain on the person doing it, but a source of enrichment. Every day spent helping others become wiser and kinder is simultaneously a day spent becoming wiser and kinder oneself. Charles Dickens appears in multiple themes throughout these 52 collections, and with good reason. His life was a sustained demonstration of the principle that service to others and personal flourishing are not in competition. Born in 1812 in Portsmouth, England, to a family that was perpetually on the edge of financial disaster, his father was eventually imprisoned for debt, and young Charles pulled from school and sent to work in a blacking factory at 12. Dickens emerged from these experiences with two enduring convictions: that suffering was real and specific, and that it could be changed. His novels were not simply entertainment. They were instruments of social transformation. Oliver Twist exposed the brutality of the workhouse system. Nicholas Nickleby attacked the conditions of Yorkshire boarding schools. A Christmas Carol, written in 6 weeks while Dickens was in financial difficulty himself, generated immediate charitable responses from readers who had their consciences activated by Scrooge's transformation. Dickens donated an enormous amount of time to charitable causes, managing amateur theatrical productions to raise funds, visiting and supporting hospitals and schools, writing journalism that kept social conditions in public view. He gave away time he could have spent earning, and he repeatedly described these activities as among the most satisfying of his life. He lived his principle. The days spent on others were among the days that counted most. This quote specifically encourages individuals to 1. Reject the false trade-off between service to others and personal development. They reinforce rather than diminish each other. 2. Understand that the character, perspective, and meaning developed through service to others is not available through any other means. 3. Treat time invested in others not as sacrifice, but as the most efficient form of self-investment available. 4. Apply this principle to the fear of wasted effort in altruistic work. The investment is always returned, if not always an expected currency. Dickens worked himself to death, literally. His public reading tours, which he conducted for financial reasons in his final decade, were so physically demanding that his doctors begged him to stop. He refused, in part because he found a connection with audiences, the direct experience of stories moving real people to laughter and tears, irreplaceable. He died in 1870 mid-tour at 58. The days he spent on others were, by his own account, the ones that made his life worth living.
Quote 12.3. Know yourself to improve yourself. Auguste Comte 1798–1857. Quote definition. Genuine self-improvement requires genuine self-knowledge as its prerequisite. Efforts to improve without first understanding what you actually are, your strengths, weaknesses, blind spots, and underlying patterns, are efforts without a map, likely to reinforce the problems they intend to solve. Quote application. Before wisdom can spread outward into communities, it must be genuinely possessed by those spreading it. Comte's principle is the internal prerequisite for external impact. Know yourself first, your biases, your blind spots, the ways your thinking has been shaped by circumstances, so that what you offer others is genuine insight rather than the projection of unexamined assumptions. Isidore Marie Auguste François Xavier Comte was born in 1798 in Montpellier, France, to a Catholic royalist family, a background he departed from emphatically when he became a Republican and agnostic as a student. He studied at the École Polytechnique in Paris, became secretary and eventually collaborator to the social theorist Henri de Saint-Simon, and spent the next several decades developing what he called positivism, a philosophy holding that genuine knowledge is based on natural phenomena and their properties and relations as verified by empirical science, and that metaphysical and theological explanations represent earlier, less developed stages of human understanding. He coined the word sociology, and is considered the founder of that discipline. His 6-volume Cours de philosophie positive is one of the most ambitious intellectual projects of the 19th century. Comte's personal life was marked by severe mental illness. He experienced a complete breakdown in 1826 that required hospitalization, attempted suicide, and spent years in a state of profound instability for the rest of his life. His principle of knowing oneself to improve oneself was, for Kant, both a philosophical conviction and a personal struggle. He spent decades analyzing the mechanisms of human thought and society with great precision, while simultaneously demonstrating in his own life how difficult genuine self-knowledge is to achieve and maintain. His example is instructive precisely because it shows the gap between the principle and its practice. This quote specifically encourages individuals to 1. Treat honest self-examination as the non-negotiable first step in any genuine improvement project. 2. Develop specific tools for self-knowledge. Journaling, feedback from trusted others, careful observation of patterns, rather than relying on casual self-impression. 3. Apply the same empirical rigor to understanding oneself that Kant applied to understanding society. Observe, analyze, revise. 4. Recognize that self-deception is the primary obstacle to self-improvement, and that the willingness to see oneself clearly is therefore the primary virtue. Auguste Comte died in 1857, having built an intellectual edifice of enormous ambition and genuine influence. Positivism shaped sociology, philosophy of science, and the organization of knowledge for generations, while never fully achieving the self-knowledge his own principle demanded. His life is both the argument for the principle and the warning about how hard it is to live. Both are instructive.
Quote 12.4. It is best to avoid the beginnings of evil. Henry David Thoreau, 1817–1862. Quote definition. The most effective strategy against evil, in its personal, social, and political forms, is upstream prevention, refusing to participate in, accommodate, or normalize its earliest manifestations before they grow into the entrenched, self-reinforcing systems that become nearly impossible to dismantle. Quote application. This quote is Thoreau's version of Da Vinci's principle from Team 8, early resistance is easier than late resistance, applied specifically to evil rather than merely to temptation. 4. Replace hate, org. It is the case for the earliest possible intervention. Address the seeds of hatred, prejudice, and cruelty in education and community before they become the forests that require decades to clear. Henry David Thoreau was born in 1817 in Concord, Massachusetts, graduated from Harvard in 1837, and spent most of the rest of his relatively short life in and around Concord, surveying land, making pencils in his family's business, observing nature with obsessive precision, and thinking and writing with a clarity and moral seriousness that made him one of the most consequential American writers of the 19th century despite his almost complete obscurity during his lifetime. Walden, his account of 2 years of deliberate simplicity living in a self-built cabin at Walden Pond, and his essay Civil Disobedience, which articulated the moral obligation to refuse compliance with unjust laws, are among the most influential texts in American literature. Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr. both credited civil disobedience as foundational to their thinking. Thoreau's principle about avoiding the beginnings of evil came directly from his experience of American political life. He had watched the United States accommodate slavery through a series of compromises, each presented as pragmatic, each normalizing the next stage of accommodation, until the institution had become so embedded in the nation's economic and political structures that dislodging it required a catastrophic civil war. He had watched the same pattern with the Mexican-American War, which he believed was prosecuted specifically to extend slavery's territory. His own act of civil disobedience, refusing to pay the poll tax and spending a night in Concord jail in 1846, was precisely an attempt to refuse the beginning of his own complicity in what he regarded as evil. He understood that the time to resist is before the habit of accommodation has formed. This quote specifically encourages individuals to 1. Develop sensitivity to the early signs of harmful patterns, in personal habits, in organizational cultures, in political movements, before they become entrenched. 2. Resist the normalizing logic that treats each new step toward evil as merely the continuation of what has already been accepted. 3. Act at the beginning rather than waiting for conditions to become obviously intolerable, by which point the cost of resistance has multiplied enormously. 4. Apply this principle to hatred specifically. Address prejudice, stereotyping, and dehumanizing language at their earliest appearances, not only when they produce visible violence. Thoreau spent his night in jail and was released the next morning when an aunt paid his tax without his permission. He was furious. He had wanted to remain in jail as a prolonged statement of non-compliance. The brevity of his imprisonment did not reduce the influence of the essay it inspired. Civil disobedience went on to shape the most important resistance movements of the 20th century. He avoided the beginning of his own complicity, and the refusal mattered more than its duration.
Quote 12.5. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal. Elizabeth Cady Stanton 1815–1902. Quote definition. The foundational truths of human equality, established in America's founding document for men, are no less self-evident when applied to women. Stanton's deliberate adaptation of the Declaration of Independence demands that its principles be applied to their logical conclusion. All human beings without exception of sex are created equal. Quote application. This quote is the clearest possible statement of the universal equality principle that underlies the entire ReplaceHate.org mission. Hatred justifies itself by denying equality, by claiming that some people are less worthy of dignity, freedom, and consideration than others. Stanton's formulation is the direct counterclaim. Equality is self-evident, universal, and admits no exceptions. Elizabeth Cady Stanton appears in Team 9 as well. Her life was rich enough in both principle and achievement to justify multiple appearances. Born in 1815 in Johnstown, New York, to a prominent judge father who openly lamented her sex, she was educated at Emma Willard's Troy Female Seminary, one of the best schools available to women in the era, and married the abolitionist Henry Brewster Stanton, insisting that the word obey be removed from their marriage ceremony. At the Seneca Falls Convention of 1848, which she co-organized with Lucretia Mott, she presented the Declaration of Sentiments, a document that deliberately echoed the Declaration of Independence in its structure and language, replacing "all men are created equal" with "all men and women are created equal." The adaptation was radical, deliberate, and precisely calculated. Stanton understood that the rhetorical power of the Declaration of Independence rested on its claim to self-evident truth, and she was appropriating that power directly, arguing that the same logical and moral foundations that justified American independence from Britain justified women's independence from legal and social subjugation. The document was signed by 68 women and 32 men at Seneca Falls, was widely ridiculed by the press, and became the founding document of the American women's suffrage movement. Stanton spent the next 50 years arguing the self-evident case she had articulated in 1848, and she was right, though she did not live to see women vote. This quote specifically encourages individuals to 1. Apply foundational equality principles to their full logical extent, not stopping at the comfortable boundaries that protect existing privilege. 2. Recognize that self-evident truths require courageous articulation and sustained advocacy before they are accepted as obvious. 3. Use the strategy of moral consistency, holding power accountable to its own stated principles, as one of the most effective tools for social change. 4. Treat the equal dignity of all human beings not as a political position but as the foundational truth from which all just social arrangements must proceed. Stanton's Declaration of Sentiments listed 18 specific grievances against the legal and social treatment of women in America: denial of the vote, exclusion from property rights, exclusion from education and profession, subjugation in marriage. The list was modeled deliberately on the Declaration's list of grievances against the Crown. She made the case in the exact language of the founding, and the argument was irrefutable, though it took 72 years, several constitutional amendments, and a world war before the political system admitted it.
Quote 12.6. I destroy my enemies when I make them my friends. Abraham Lincoln 1806 to 1865. Quote definition. The most complete and lasting victory over an adversary is not their defeat, humiliation, or elimination. It is their transformation into an ally. Friendship eliminates the enemy more thoroughly than conflict ever could, because it changes the relationship at its root rather than merely suppressing its symptoms. Quote application. This is one of the most strategically sophisticated principles in the entire 52 Teams collection, and it is the operating philosophy of the ReplaceHate.org mission at its deepest level. The goal is not to defeat the hateful, but to replace hate, which requires the transformation of those who currently practice into people who no longer do. Making friends of enemies is not soft. It is the most effective strategy available. Abraham Lincoln appears in Team 11 as well, and his presence in 2 teams is earned by a life of sufficient depth and consistency to yield multiple distinct lessons. The destroy enemies by making them friends principle was not an abstract aspiration for Lincoln. It was his actual operating method, demonstrated most dramatically in his construction of the cabinet he formed upon winning the presidency in 1860. His three primary rivals for the Republican nomination, William Seward, Salmon Chase, and Edward Bates, all believed themselves more qualified than Lincoln and made no secret of it. Lincoln appointed all three to his cabinet, Seward as Secretary of State, Chase as Secretary of the Treasury, Bates as Attorney General. The decision was considered bizarre by political standards of the era, which expected victorious candidates to reward loyalists and sideline rivals. Lincoln's reasoning was straightforward. These were the most capable available people. They would be more dangerous as opponents than as collaborators, and the only way to convert their opposition into support was to give them genuine responsibility and treat them as genuine partners. Seward, who initially attempted to position himself as the de facto prime minister running the administration through an inexperienced president, became Lincoln's closest advisor and most loyal supporter. Chase plotted against Lincoln throughout his tenure, and yet Lincoln reappointed him Chief Justice of the Supreme Court after the election of 1864. Lincoln was making friends of enemies as a deliberate, sustained, strategic practice, and it worked. This quote specifically encourages individuals to 1. Reframe adversarial relationships as transformation opportunities rather than conflicts to be won or lost. 2. Invest in the humanity of opponents, finding the common ground, the shared interests, the mutual recognition, rather than in their defeat. 3. Understand that genuine reconciliation is more powerful and more durable than any victory achieved through conflict. 4. Apply this principle to the work of replacing hate. The goal is not to silence or defeat the hateful, but to create conditions in which hatred becomes unnecessary and friendship becomes possible. Lincoln's second inaugural address, delivered in March 1865, 6 weeks before his assassination, contained the most explicit articulation of this principle applied to a nation. With malice toward none, with charity for all. He was proposing to make friends of the Confederacy. He was killed before he could try. The Reconstruction policies that followed his death, administered without his genius for reconciliation, demonstrated in painful detail what it costs when the principle of destroying enemies by making them friends is abandoned.
Quote 12.7. Always forgive your enemies. Nothing annoys them so much. Oscar Wilde, 1854 to 1900. Quote definition. Forgiveness of enemies is simultaneously a moral virtue, a psychological liberation for the person who forgives, and, with characteristic Wildean irony, a more effective irritant to the enemy than retaliation would be, because it refuses to engage on the enemy's preferred terms of conflict and resentment. Quote application. Wilde's wit delivers a serious truth. Forgiveness is not defeat. It is a form of power, the power to refuse the dynamic that hatred requires to sustain itself. For replacehate.org. This principle is a case that the most subversive response to hatred is not counter-hatred but the disarming generosity of genuine forgiveness, which the hateful find more unsettling than any opposition. Oscar Fingal O'Flaherty Wills, Wilde was born in 1854 in Dublin to a distinguished Irish family. His father, Sir William Wilde, was the leading ear and eye surgeon in Ireland. His mother, Lady Jane Wilde, was a poet and Irish nationalist who wrote under the name Speranza. He was educated at Trinity College, Dublin, and Magdalen College, Oxford, where he developed the aesthetic philosophy and brilliant conversational style that made him the most talked-about man in London by his late 20s. His plays, The Importance of Being Earnest, An Ideal Husband, Lady Windermere's Fan, are still performed worldwide. His novel The Picture of Dorian Gray remains one of the most widely read works of Victorian fiction. His fairy tales, his poems, and his critical essays display a range and depth that his popular reputation as a wit sometimes obscures. The wit of this particular observation contains layers that repay examination. On the surface it is a joke, forgiveness as a weapon of annoyance. At the next level it is a psychological observation. Enemies who expect resentment and retaliation are genuinely disoriented by forgiveness, which removes the conflict they were prepared for and leaves them without the narrative of persecution they need. At the deepest level it is a moral argument. Forgiveness is superior to resentment not only because it is right, but because it is more powerful It frees the forgiver from the weight of sustained hostility and deprives the enemy of the fuel that hostility provides. Wilde understood all three levels because he had been on the receiving end of devastating social hostility, the prosecution and imprisonment that destroyed his career and health, and had to decide, in his prison cell at Reading Jail, what to do with the hatred he felt toward those who had destroyed him. His answer was De Profundis, the extraordinary letter of self-examination and partial forgiveness he wrote to Lord Alfred Douglas from prison. It was not a joke. This quote specifically encourages individuals to 1. Practice forgiveness as an active strategy rather than a passive capitulation. It is a form of power, not weakness. 2. Recognize that resentment binds the resentful person to the object of their resentment more effectively than any chain. 3. Understand the disarming effect of genuine forgiveness on those who expect and depend on counter-hostility to maintain their position. 4. Apply Wilde's wit as a memory device for a serious principle. The annoyance forgiveness causes enemies is a sign that it is working. Oscar Wilde died in Paris in 1900, 2 years after his release from prison, in poverty and poor health, under an assumed name. He had been one of the most celebrated men in England. He died in obscurity. His forgiveness of those who had destroyed him was partial and hard-won, documented in De Profundis with painful honesty. But he maintained the principle even under the most difficult conditions, and his works, suppressed during his lifetime, have outlasted every enemy who tried to silence him. The annoyance, it turns out, was permanent.
Quote 12.8. Justice delayed is justice denied. William E. Gladstone, 1809 to 1898. Quote definition. When justice, the fair, timely redress of wrongs, is postponed, obstructed, or indefinitely deferred, the delay itself becomes a form of injustice. A right that cannot be exercised when needed is not genuinely a right. A remedy that arrives too late provides no remedy at all. Quote application. For the mission of making America wiser and kinder, Gladstone's principle is the case for urgency. Hatred does its damage now. Injustice compounds over time. The work of education, reconciliation, and community building cannot be deferred to a more convenient moment, because for those suffering the effects of hatred and ignorance, delay is not a neutral choice, but an active harm. William Ewart Gladstone was born in 1809 in Liverpool to a wealthy merchant family with Scottish roots and strong evangelical Christian convictions. He was educated at Eton and Christ Church, Oxford, entered Parliament at 22 as a Conservative, and over the next 6 decades underwent one of the most dramatic political evolutions in British parliamentary history, moving from a defender of slavery, his father-owned plantations in the West Indies, to a passionate advocate for Irish Home Rule, the disestablishment of the Church of Ireland, expanded suffrage, and educational reform. He served as Prime Minister 4 times, a record unmatched in British history, and was the dominant figure of Victorian liberal politics. The phrase justice delayed is justice denied, most often attributed to Gladstone, though its precise origin is debated, captures the operating principle of his most consequential legislative campaigns. His Irish Church Act of 1869, which disestablished the Anglican Church of Ireland, had been argued for decades by Irish Catholics who resented being taxed to support a church most of them opposed. Gladstone pushed it through Parliament in his first year as Prime Minister, arguing explicitly that the delay had already done enormous damage to the relationship between Britain and Ireland. His Irish Land Acts attempted to address the catastrophic injustice of Irish tenant conditions with a similar urgency. He understood that justice deferred is not merely postponed but transformed into resentment, into radicalism, into the kind of hardened opposition that eventually makes peaceful resolution impossible. This quote specifically encourages individuals to 1. Treat urgency as an ethical requirement in justice work, not merely a practical preference, but a moral obligation. 2. Recognize that delay in addressing injustice is not neutral but actively harmful. The longer hatred and inequity go unaddressed, the deeper their roots grow. 3. Resist the comfortable deferral of difficult conversations and necessary changes to a more convenient future moment. 4. Apply this principle to the personal dimension as well. Forgiveness, reconciliation, and honest engagement delayed too long become harder, not easier. Gladstone introduced Irish Home Rule bills in 1886 and 1893, both of which failed. The first split his own Liberal Party, the second was rejected by the House of Lords. He died in 1898 without seeing Ireland achieve self-governance. The justice he argued for was delayed by decades, and the denial of it contributed directly to the escalating violence that ultimately produced the Easter Rising of 1916 and the Irish War of Independence. He had understood the cost of delay precisely. History confirmed his analysis in the most painful possible way.
How they work together as a unified philosophy to replace hate and guide a life with motivational education for all. The Transform Strategically Framework. Agency Layer. Making Opportunities and Investing in Others, quotes 1-2. Bacon. Establish the active generative posture. Wise people make more opportunities than they find, as the operating stance from which all strategic transformation begins. Dickens. Reveal the counterintuitive truth that investment in others is investment in oneself. Service and self-development are not competing priorities, but mutually reinforcing ones. Together, define the strategic orientation of the entire framework, active, outward-facing, and grounded in the understanding that creating value for others is the mechanism by which strategic people create value for themselves. Bacon provides the outward-facing generative drive. Dickens ensures that the drive toward making opportunities includes others as beneficiaries rather than merely as means. One without the other produces either selfish strategy or diffuse goodwill. Together they produce strategic service. Wisdom Layer, Self-Knowledge and Prevention, quotes 3-4. Kant. Establish self-knowledge as the prerequisite for genuine improvement. Knowing what you actually are is the only reliable foundation for changing what you wish to become. Thoreau. Apply the preventive principle to the moral dimension. Avoid the beginnings of evil, because downstream correction always costs more than upstream prevention. Together, provide the internal discipline that strategic transformation requires. Kant's self-knowledge prevents the common failure of improvement efforts that reinforce problems rather than solving them, because they were built on a misunderstanding of the self they were trying to improve. Thoreau's prevention principle ensures that the improved self maintains its ground by refusing the early accommodations that gradually compromise it. Together they describe the inward practice of the strategically transforming person. See yourself clearly and refuse evil at its first appearance. Justice Layer. Universal Equality and the Urgency of Now, quotes 5-8. Stanton. Assert the foundational truth. All human beings are created equal, as the self-evident principle that strategic transformation must serve and that no just social arrangement can contradict. Gladstone. Demand urgency in the pursuit of justice. Delay is not neutral but actively harmful, a form of denial that compounds the injustice it postpones. Together, establish both the destination and the timeline of strategic transformation. Stanton names what we are building toward: a world that takes universal equality seriously in practice, not just in declaration, while Gladstone insists that the building cannot wait. Together they create the moral urgency that drives the entire framework. The destination is clear, the need is immediate, and delay serves only those who benefit from things remaining as they are. Transformative strategy, quotes 6-7. Lincoln. Transform enemies into friends through relationship. Wilde. Use forgiveness as both moral choice and strategic tool. Together, convert opposition through love-based strategic wisdom.
Free Easy Extra Advantage Math, Spelling and Reading Workbooks you can download for free at stop2think.com or buy at educationstopshate.com. Free Easy Math Wisdom Workbooks with octo repetition to grow math self-confidence. You'll get plenty of repetitive practice of age ranges and averages of our 52 teams of 8 quote authors. Free Easy Alpha Cipher-coded puzzles teach letters, numbers, and phrases using antique wisdoms that encourage and educate. Can you decode this cipher quote of encouragement using either our Learning to Spell or just for fun instructions? And since time is money, practice reading faster with 52 teams of antique rival wisdoms that have passed the test of time to encourage, educate, and entertain generations for centuries. We offer printed versions and timed videos with background music. Sign up for free weekly emails of 52 teams of antique rival wisdom workbooks with easy math, spelling, and reading practice. And, if you'd like to get paid for sharing our wearable wisdoms, keep this in mind. Everyone I know wears a shirt, and most of us change them daily, so change your shirt and change the world. Social equalities are blatantly subliminal antique positive wisdoms repetitively shared without saying a word. This applies to all our wearable shareable wisdoms, like pretty witty baby onesies and baby tees that you and others will see and read multiple times a day. The same is true with pretty witty kids, but they'll also share these wisdoms with anyone that can read at daycare or school. Youthful truths let your kids gain confidence sharing antique wisdoms with their friends. Imagine them sharing words of wisdom with classmates and teachers. Therefore I think teas I wear is a super easy way to share words of wisdom that have passed the test of time. Our social equalities help make us all wiser and kinder with blatantly subliminal messages promoting a more fair and equal opportunity society for all. And don't forget our giftwisdoms.com for birthdays and holidays that makes it easy to share the wisdom with clothing, coffee mugs, and magnets. So do the future a favor by encouraging, educating, and entertaining with words of wisdom that have passed the test of time to make us all wiser and kinder. With wearable wisdoms to fit babies, kids, and adults. You can clothe a whole family, city, or state. Join the 52 of 8 today.